So my name is Max Lugavere. I do many things. I'm a bit of a multi-hyphenate, but primarily a health and science journalist. I'm an author. I'm a filmmaker. I'm a podcaster. This is just for those unaware of my body of work. I love to talk about the fact that my work has. I'm very grateful. I get to reach many people, from lay audiences to academic cohorts alike. I have written 3 books at this point: Genius Foods, Genius Kitchen, and The Genius Life. I get to go on national media like The Today Show, the Joe Rogan podcast, which was super fun, among others. I host a podcast. This textbook down in the center lower portion of the screen is actually one of my proudest accomplishments. I got to, as a non-academic, I got to co-author a chapter in a textbook for clinicians on the clinical practice of dementia prevention, published by Springer in 2019. That was super exciting to do. And then on the left-hand portion of the screen, on the bottom half, is a poster for a documentary that I'm releasing this month, actually next week, next Thursday, which is super exciting. It's called Little Empty Boxes. And it is the first ever documentary to cover dementia through the lens of prevention. It's also a very personal story for me, which I'm going to get into, but this releases next Thursday. And I've been working on this project for 10 years, so I'm super excited about it. At littleemptyboxes.com, you can learn more. But the reason why I became interested specifically in how to improve brain health, cognitive function, and mental health through food and lifestyle is because at a very young age, my mother was diagnosed with a rare form of dementia called Lewy body dementia, which is akin to having both Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease at the same time. It's a rare neurodegenerative condition. It usually strikes people much later in life, but my mom started to display symptoms at the tender age of 58, and it caught me and my family completely off guard. I had not been a medical doctor, I had not been an academic scientist, I had been a journalist. And when she became ill, it was the strongest call to action that I've ever experienced in my life. I became obsessed with trying to learn everything that I possibly could about nutrition and lifestyle and how these variables mediate good health, or conversely, poor health. It was a journey, again, that began about 10 years ago. And I've been really lucky to learn and share as much as I have. Now, back at the onset of her symptoms, I had a bias for nutrition. I'd always been interested in fitness and nutrition, like many young people are today. And I started to look at the modern world, and I asked myself why it seems to be that the modern world has become so toxic that it's pulling the trigger on so many chronic conditions today: cancer, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, and yes, dementia. And one of the more obvious ways in which the modern world has mutated is the food supply. Now, today you go through the aisles of your average supermarket, and what you'll notice is that only the minority of foods in your average supermarket would actually qualify as real food. The vast majority of items in your average supermarket are what food scientists are now referring to as ultra-processed foods. In fact, 73% of the items in your average supermarket are ultra-processed. Now, these food-like products are dominating the standard American diet, and this is a diet that we are now exporting to the rest of the world, unfortunately. And the data is seemingly pouring out. Every month, there's a new study linking the overconsumption of these kinds of foods, which hang out in the aisles of our supermarkets, with poor health outcomes. This is a photo project undertaken by a photojournalist who went around the world and he looked at the average weekly grocery hauls for families in nations around the world. And this is a British family. In England, they're doing a little bit better than us. About 50% of the calories that your average Brit in England consumes comes from these ultra-processed foods. This is a week's worth of groceries. You essentially have to squint to identify the perishable fresh food. I mean, I can see some whole fruit, but by and large, the bulk of what people tend to be eating in this country now, unfortunately, are these packaged processed foods, foods that come in bags, packages, They have shelf lives that are seemingly infinite. And here in the US, we're doing even worse. So we're about 60% of the calories on average that your average adult is consuming comes from these kinds of foods. And if you look at different corners of the socioeconomic spectrum, we're doing even worse. So unfortunately, Black Americans, for example, on average, consume about 80% ultra-processed foods. You look at children are consuming 70% ultra-processed foods on average. So it's a huge problem, and there's no one factor that is to blame. There are systemic issues at play, obviously. Some people today in the US still live in food deserts, unfortunately, but this is a massive public health problem. So here we have a meta-analysis that was published over the past year linking the overconsumption of these foods to over 30 damaging health outcomes. Now, these include the obvious chronic health conditions that are well known to be saddling modern society today, type 2 diabetes, obesity, as I've mentioned, but also we're starting to see the connection between ultra-processed food consumption and poor mental health, such as depression, anxiety, and the like. So what is the antidote? Well, obviously the antidote is to consume fewer ultra-processed foods and to prioritize whole foods. Real foods don't have extensive ingredients lists. They are the ingredients, right? These are the foods that tend to lie around the perimeter of the supermarket. We also want to prioritize protein. I'm going to explain exactly why this is so useful from a health standpoint. And then finally, we do want to prioritize whole plants. Now, as I've alluded to, shopping the perimeter of the supermarket and dipping into the aisles occasionally for healthful staples like legumes, extra virgin olive oil, that's all fine and good. But generally, supermarkets are designed the same way, not just here in the United States, but increasingly around the world. The modern supermarket, the refrigerated sections tend to be around the perimeter of the supermarket, which is where you find the fresh produce, you find eggs, buttermilk, meat, fish, eggs, and things like that. So this is actually mind-blowing when I first stumbled upon this heuristic, but and it's still, I think, surprising to many people today. But generally, we want to shop the perimeter. Again, that's where the whole foods tend to be. It's the aisles that tend to be home to all of these ultra-processed foods. Secondly, we want to prioritize protein. Now, this is an area where my thinking has evolved, actually. When I wrote my first book, Genius Foods, this wasn't something that didn't seem to be as important as the research has subsequently validated as being a real staple in terms of a health-modifying behavior. We want to prioritize protein in our diets. Now, I've shown some examples of high-protein foods. We've got red meat, chicken, fish, even pork, great. Now, why should we prioritize protein in our diets? Well, there are many reasons for this. So for one, protein is the most satiating of the macronutrients. Now, macronutrients, it's a multi-syllabic word, but it's really simple. It's carbs, protein, and fat. Those are your three major macronutrients. Studies show that our hunger mechanisms are actually regulated by our necessity for dietary protein. Dietary protein is the most expensive macronutrient to find, not just in nature, right, but also in the supermarket. And ultra-processed foods tend to have a few salient characteristics in common. One of them is that they tend to be dilute of protein, because protein is so expensive. Most ultra-processed foods, chips, pastries, confectionery products, crackers, they all tend to be some combination of carbs and fat. They tend to be diluted of protein. Manufacturers do this for many reasons. One is that protein is the most satiating, right? So we tend to eat more of the junk foods that are primarily carbs and fat. Secondarily, and perhaps most importantly to a food manufacturer, is that carbs and fat are cheap. Protein is expensive. It's the most satiating of the macronutrients. So if you struggle with hunger, even an incremental increase in dietary protein intake will assuage your hunger and lead to an improvement in body composition over time. Usually people who even incrementally increase their protein intake see a spontaneous improvement in body composition. Less fat mass, greater lean mass. Point number 2 is that protein supports your lean mass, as I've mentioned, your muscle mass, which becomes increasingly important to maintain as we age. We all want to fight off frailty as we age. We're starting now to see the connection between frailty and conditions like dementia, Alzheimer's disease, loss in bone mineral density, for example, impaired insulin signaling, which is the hallmark of type 2 diabetes. So we want to support our lean mass. Obviously, resistance training, exercise is crucially important, but from a dietary standpoint, prioritizing protein is mission critical. Is this all making sense so far? Yes. Wonderful, amazing. Tissue regeneration. Your body is made of protein. I don't think that we fully appreciate how intuitive this is, and yet we tend to overlook it. We are made of protein. When we ingest protein, proteins get broken down into their constituent amino acids. Amino acids form the precursor, supply the precursor molecules to your neurotransmitters, for example, serotonin, dopamine. These are all these brain chemicals, these signaling molecules that are important for learning, for memory, for experiencing joy, sadness even. We rely on the amino acids derived from protein to support production of these neurotransmitters. And so much more. Enzymes, your skeletal, your bones, skeletal muscle, obviously, so much more. We are made of protein. Protein is also highly unlikely to be stored as fat. It is not a good energy source because it's so valuable to the body. On the other hand, fat, dietary fat, is very easily stored as fat. It's plug and play to your adipose tissue. And carbohydrates, when overconsumed, are also easily converted to fat in the liver. So protein is very unlikely to be stored as fat. They've even done some really interesting overfeeding studies where they've put people in a calorie surplus by overfeeding them protein. And completely counterintuitively and running counter to what we know about energy balance, they found that even when people are overfed protein, they don't seem to gain weight. There's a phenomenon known as rabbit starvation, in fact, where if you were to feed somebody only lean protein, they would ultimately starve to death. 30% of the calories that you ingest via protein are burned off from digestion alone. This is known as the thermic effect of food. So anybody who's even somewhat familiar with nutrition might know that fat contains about 9 calories per gram, carbohydrates and protein contain 4 calories per gram. But about a third of the calories that you ingest via protein are burned off simply when we digest that protein. And that's about 6 times higher of a thermic effect than we get from carbohydrates and fat. So carbohydrates and fat, 5 to 10% burned off via digestion. With protein, you burn off about 30%. Totally safe for healthy kidneys. I was having this conversation last night. It has been long known that high-protein diets do not impair healthy kidney function. This is even within the medical community, there is still a lot of confusion around this, that high-protein diets are totally safe for healthy kidneys, and there is now research starting to come out showing us that high-protein diets also can help prevent chronic kidney disease, which most oftenly today in the United States is a result of type 2 diabetes. And so we can prevent that essentially by opting for higher levels of protein in our diets. And data suggests that when we prioritize protein in our diets from foods like red meat, eggs, and the like, we're also ingesting a lot of very important micronutrients like vitamin B12, zinc, and the like. So a piece of steak is not just protein, it's loaded with other really important nutrients that we know support whole body vitality. Here's a study that has shown us that insofar as protein can help fight off frailty, that higher intakes of protein is associated with healthy aging. This study just came out, actually, and it found that people who tend to consume more protein, they also seem to be free of age-related disability, disease, and the like. So we want to, again, prioritize protein. I love this tweet from a nutritionist. It's better to overconsume protein, even by a lot, than to underconsume it, even by a little. Why? Because when we underconsume protein, we tend to be hungrier for carbs and fat. That tends to compel us to reach for, the quick fixes, the junk foods, and the like. So how much protein ought we be consuming every day to optimize our body composition? Well, the data suggests that for people who are resistance training, which I think everybody in this room should be resistance training, right? And resistance training doesn't necessarily mean having a gym membership and being on some bodybuilder routine, right? Resistance training could be pushing against gravity. It could be calisthenic exercises, push-ups even. Yoga is a great form of resistance exercise. For people who are resistance training, to optimize the effort that they're putting into that training, the research shows that we want to be consuming about 0.7 grams of protein per pound of our ideal weight. So if you're relatively lean, you can use your body weight. And if you are significantly overweight, you can use your goal weight, which is thought to be an approximation of your lean weight. So whatever your weight is, you want to take that, multiply by 7, and that should give you an approximate goal to reach every day. So as an example, if you're a 150-pound female, you generally want to reach for 105 grams of protein a day. Not so difficult when you break it across 3 meals. That's about 35 grams per meal. Easy peasy. For men, a 200-pound male, you want to reach for about 140 grams of protein per day. That's 47 grams per meal, assuming 3 meals a day. This is a great slide to take a screenshot of or a photo of. This is what 30 grams of protein looks like. Now, I don't have any plant-based sources of protein up here because this is not controversial that animal source proteins tend to be the highest quality, extremely high quality in terms of their digestibility, very high quality in terms of their amino acid profile. If you are consuming adequate protein on a 24-hour basis, protein quality becomes less important, but for people who underconsume protein, and there are certain cohorts that typically underconsume protein, vegans, vegetarians, children, older adults, protein quality does become crucially important. So I'm agnostic as to where you get your protein from, provided you're getting enough on a daily basis. Now, one of my favorite sources of protein are eggs. Eggs are a cognitive multivitamin. An egg yolk literally contains a little bit of everything that nature has deemed important to grow a healthy brain. A chicken brain, but nonetheless, eggs have a little bit of everything that nature has deemed important to nurture the brain. Vitamin B12, protein, of course, carotenoids, these plant pigments that I'm going to talk about, zinc. Also, egg yolks have been demonized over the past couple of decades because they're a rich source of dietary cholesterol. We now know that dietary cholesterol for most people has virtually no downside with regard to cardiovascular risk. Very little impact on serum cholesterol, dietary cholesterol for most people. There are always exceptions to the rule, but generally, dietary cholesterol is nothing to be concerned with. And in fact, the brain is made of cholesterol. The brain, despite accounting for only 2 to 3% of your body's mass, accounts for 25% of the cholesterol found in your body. Now, you don't need to consume cholesterol to support brain health. This is a big misconception. Even within the field of nutrition, your brain produces all of the cholesterol that it needs. But that is to say that foods that contain cholesterol tend to also contain other nutrients that are very valuable. And so it makes sense that an egg yolk would be full of cholesterol because, again, it is there to grow a brain. It's also one of the top sources, actually the top source in the standard American diet, of an essential nutrient called choline. Now, 90% of adults don't meet the adequate intake for choline on a daily basis, but choline provides the backbone to acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter important for learning and memory. And this is a study that found that men, over 22 years, had a almost 30% risk reduction for Alzheimer's disease when they consumed the most choline. And this was irrespective of whether or not they carried the most well-defined Alzheimer's risk gene. So choline is crucially important for the brain. And this study just came out finding that egg consumers, compared to non-consumers, had a 50% reduced risk for the development of Alzheimer's disease. There's still a lot of confusion today around the potential benefits or harms of red meat consumption. I think red meat is a health food. It's one of the most nutrient-dense foods that exists. We now have observational data that runs counter to the narrative that red meat is universally unhealthy, showing us that people who consume more of it as they get older tend to be in better health. Now, red meat is a continuum. Obviously, there's processed meat, there's unprocessed meat, there is meat that comes from the factory farm system, there's meat that comes from regenerative grass-fed, grass-finished farms, for example. My preference for all of you is to prioritize unprocessed meat that comes from a regenerative, grass-fed, grass-finished system. The meat's going to be better for you, it's going to be leaner, and the like. But don't fear red meat. Now, moving on to whole plants, advocating on behalf of dark leafy greens is almost controversial today in the field of nutrition because nutrition, like everything else, has become so polarized. There's tribalism in the nutrition sphere just as there is everywhere else. We have carnivores, we've got vegans. A lot of people are concerned with the presence of plant defense compounds or compounds like oxalates in dark leafy greens. But for most people, I think that there is a lot more benefit to be gained than risk incurred when consuming dark leafy greens. And whether your favorites are kale, spinach, arugula, they are rich in certain compounds that we know are directly supportive of good cognitive function and brain health. I think that I broke the news on two of these compounds in my first book, Genius Foods, lutein and zeaxanthin, which are carotenoids, so these are plant pigments, that are found in abundance in dark leafy greens. Now, if anybody has ever looked at the nutrition facts label of an eye health supplement in a pharmacy, you'll notice that eye health supplements typically contain lutein and zeaxanthin because we've known for decades that these carotenoids, which again are concentrated in dark leafy greens, directly support eye health. They can help prevent a condition called age-related macular degeneration. But we now know that the eyes are not just a window to the brain. The eyes are an extension of the brain. And these same compounds actually also accumulate in the brain, where they help protect against oxidative stress. They can help prevent lipid oxidation in the brain. And your brain is made of fats, lipids, essentially. And so these compounds we're starting to see not just can help protect our brains as they age over time, but might even improve cognitive function. So here are a few studies, two observational studies, one randomized controlled trial, linking consumption of dietary carotenoids like lutein and zeaxanthin, which again are abundant in dark leafy greens, to better cognitive health. And down in the lower portion of the screen, this was actually a randomized controlled trial from University of Georgia that found that when young and healthy college students were given supplemental lutein and zeaxanthin, they saw an improvement, a boost in their visual processing speed, which is the ability to perceive a stimulus and respond to it, right? Very important for driving, very important when catching something as it falls off the kitchen island, playing video games. Visual processing speed is incredibly important. And this shocked researchers because young college students are already thought to be at the peak of their cognitive prowess. But what this study showed was that lutein and zeaxanthin, even to this young and healthy cohort, was capable of boosting cognitive performance. So we want to prioritize dark leafy greens in our diets. I like to advocate for a big bowl of dark leafy greens every day, like a salad a day. Easy peasy, as a form of cognitive insurance. Now, another benefit of dark leafy greens that I think is certainly worth talking about is that they're the top source of compounds called nitrates. Now, nitrates are super valuable to our cardiovascular system. When we consume foods like spinach, arugula, radish, celery, lettuce, any form of lettuce, and beets. Beets are actually probably most famous for their nitrate content. We ingest these nitrates, which bacteria in our mouths convert to nitrite, which then supports what's called the nitric oxide pathway in our bodies. So nitric oxide is a gas produced in our blood vessels that helps to lower blood pressure and increase blood flow. There's actually a very famous drug on the market called Viagra that works by modulating this pathway, this nitric oxide pathway, to increase blood flow to a certain region of the body. But we can boost nitric oxide in our blood vessels naturally by supplying our bodies with the raw materials to create this gas, and that is nitrate. So when we eat one high nitrate meal, a bowl of dark leafy greens that contain arugula, for example, and we chew those dark leafy greens slowly, allowing the bacteria in our mouths to break down nitrate, convert it to nitrite, we actually see a boost in nitric oxide about 90 minutes after that meal, which can improve blood flow to the brain and elsewhere. Now, maintaining a healthy blood pressure is crucially important to good brain health and good brain function. This was a seminal study in the field of dementia prevention that gave people with high blood pressure, hypertension, an aggressive pharmacologic treatment for their high blood pressure. And what they found was that when people were treated for their high blood pressure, aggressively, they saw a significant risk reduction for mild cognitive impairment, which is essentially pre-dementia, right? Now, what's so exciting about this is that we now know that diet and lifestyle are just as effective as medications when it comes to reducing high blood pressure. And eating dark leafy greens, foods that contain nitrates, on a regular basis can help to normalize high blood pressure. Now, if you're on high blood pressure lowering drugs, you do want to be careful with a sudden increase of nitrate ingestion. You want to check with your doctor. But for people who are already healthy, consuming dark leafy greens on a regular basis, it's a great form of cardioprotection. Now, the caveat is that about 40% of Americans on a daily basis frequently use antiseptic mouthwash. Now, why is this a problem? Well, what I said earlier is that we rely on oral bacteria for this conversion. So if you're frequently swishing with a compound that's indiscriminately destroying the bacteria in your mouths that play a pivotal role in the conversion of these nitrates to nitrite, you're essentially negating the ability of your food, your dark leafy greens, to have a cardioprotective effect. So you could be eating a salad a day, right? And basically missing the opportunity to improve your blood pressure and to boost blood flow. We need more research on this to be sure, but here are two observational studies that found that when people frequently used antiseptic mouthwash, so this is twice a day, every day, they saw a doubling of risk for hypertension, and they saw a 50% increased risk for the development of type 2 diabetes, because nitric oxide is also used it's essentially a hormone in the body in many ways, and it's important for insulin signaling as well. And then this study down on the bottom portion of the screen showed us that when people exercised, which is one of the most powerful antihypertensive interventions, and they swished with antiseptic mouthwash after their exercise, it blunted the antihypertensive effect of the exercise. I go to my gym and I see people in the locker room all the time swishing with the mouthwash that they make available to gym goers, and I'm like, this is a huge mistake. You do not want to be regularly swishing with antiseptic mouthwash. Now, when it comes to healthy fats, which fats to reach for, there's no better fat than extra virgin olive oil. There are now meta-analyses showing us that extra virgin olive oil is anti-inflammatory, can reduce inflammation in the body, which is the cornerstone of modern chronic disease, might also incite depression in a subset of patients. And the brain is made of fat, so the fats that you eat on a daily basis have a direct relationship over time with brain health. We need more research to confirm this hypothesis, but we know that fats certain types of fats and lipophilic substances have easy access to the brain. And so we want to be really mindful of the fats that we're ingesting. And extra virgin olive oil, which is one of the staples of the Mediterranean dietary pattern, is the primary fat source that I use in my kitchen. And part of the reason why extra virgin olive oil is so good for you, particularly relative to other fats that now dominate the standard American diet, is that we've been pressing olives for hundreds of years to create extra virgin olive oil. On the other hand, oils that have TV ads for them and that we're told to consume, like these industrially refined grain and seed oils, canola oil, corn, soybean, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower oil, have to go through innumerable processing steps, and these steps tend to damage the oil. And we don't have any long-term data on what these kinds of fats are doing to our brain health long-term. So we do want to be mindful and to reduce our intake of these ultra-refined grain and seed oils, which now I think many people are talking about on social media. They are not the smoking gun that I think many people on social media today make them out to be. However, I do think that they are better off being avoided, especially because we just don't know long-term how these novel fats are impacting our long-term brain health. And this is a meta-analysis that has shown us, when looking at a myriad of different studies, that almost any dose of extra virgin olive oil seems to have an anti-inflammatory effect. It's almost medicinal in quality. And interestingly, extra virgin olive oil shares a mechanism with ibuprofen, which is a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. Chronic use of ibuprofen is associated with cardiovascular events. Chronic use of extra virgin olive oil is associated with reduced risk of cardiovascular events. Now, I'm obviously a huge nutrition nerd. I could talk about nutrition all day long. I love the field, but I think it's also really important to underscore that nutrition is just one slice of the pie, right? Nutrition is just one part of the pie. Today we have many problems health-wise, and nutrition is certainly one of those issues, but there are other issues that I would like to draw your attention to. And so I think avoiding toxic exposures, you could be doing everything right from a nutrition standpoint, but if you're not mindful of where environmental toxicants lie, then you're not equipped appropriately with the tools to avoid them. And so when it comes to avoiding toxic exposures, which we now are starting to see have a direct impact on brain health and brain function, among other physiologic features, we definitely want to prioritize organic for certain products. We want to be mindful of air quality, and we want to make sure that we're drinking clean water. I travel a lot, and just last night, for the first time in my career, I realized that I could Instacart from a hotel room. And so I ordered spring water in glass, which I think is a great alternative to bottled water, purified water, which is essentially just tap water, in plastic. And I'm going to explain why I think that's so crucially important. Now, when it comes to prioritizing organic for certain products, I'll be the first to say that organic is not a panacea, and organic food is not necessarily more nutritious than non-organic food. And this is where a lot of the confusion around organic lies. It's not a perfect farming system, and what's natural isn't necessarily safer than what is synthetic. Some of the most toxic chemicals on Earth are natural, right? All that being said, if we can reduce our exposure to synthetic herbicides and pesticides, certainly occupationally, but also by way of our food, I think that it would do our health a lot of favors, particularly because these compounds, these chemicals, these industrial chemicals are so heavily commercialized that sometimes getting to the truth of how they impact human health can be incredibly tenuous and difficult. There is a lot of gaslighting from the industrial ag industry with regard to some of these chemicals. And so when it comes to foods that we eat, the skin or the peel, the rind or the entire leaf, I think there is value in doing the best we can to reach for organic when given the opportunity. I don't eat organic berries exclusively, but when given the choice, I think it's a worthwhile, safe decision to make. And with grain products, wheat, for example, and oats, there's no such thing as an essential grain, but if you do choose to consume grains like wheat, oats, and the like, it's really important to know that herbicides like glyphosate are not just used to grow these food products, but they're used as a desiccant to dry them pre-harvest. Makes it a lot easier to harvest these grains. And they've done studies looking at, for example, oat products here in the United States, and they find them to be highly contaminated with innumerable industrial herbicides, glyphosate being one of them, and there are others. So prioritizing organic when given the opportunity for certain products, I think, very valuable. We want to avoid toxic exposures via the air. Now, this is an area, again, another area where I've evolved, and if you would have asked me 5 years ago how important I thought this was, I would say probably secondarily or even tertiarily to nutrition. But I now believe air pollution to be a major cause of chronic disease, or at least a contributor to chronic disease. And one thing that's really shocking that most people don't realize is that the nose is the front door to the brain. The nose is the front door to the brain. Compounds that you inhale through your nose have direct access to the brain. They bypass the detoxification that an ingested compound might undergo, and have essentially are given an express elevator to the olfactory bulb in the brain, which is directly connected to other regions of the brain that are important for learning and memory. And in fact, one of the earliest preclinical features of cognitive decline and Parkinson's disease is a decline in the sense of smell. So here we have olfactory neurons that we can see clearly branching out from the olfactory bulb directly into the nose, into the epithelium of the sinus cavity. So we want to be really careful of the air that we're exposed to. Parkinson's disease, which is actually the condition that my mother had, Lewy body dementia, has more in common with Parkinson's disease than it does Alzheimer's disease. And there has been, historically, a lot less research on the environmental triggers that might contribute to Parkinson's disease. Part of this has to do with the fact that funding is predominantly, with regard to Parkinson's disease, it goes predominantly into the genetics of the condition as opposed to the environmental factors. But we're now starting to see that Parkinson's disease might actually be a man-made disease created by exposure to environmental pollutants. Dr. Ray Dorsey is a neurologist. He's a University of Rochester researcher who's become a friend and colleague, and I've had him on my podcast. And he's shown a striking link between exposure to certain herbicides and pesticides and industrial solvents and risk for Parkinson's disease. So we want to be really careful. And in fact, it's a newly identified modifiable risk factor. Exposure to air pollution is now thought to be causal with regards to Alzheimer's disease, the most common form of dementia. So we just want to be really mindful. We want to make sure that our air is clean and the like. And then finally, we want to make sure that more often than not, we are drinking clean water. We now know that there are forever chemicals in drinking water around the United States, chemicals like PFAS. Certain pharmaceutical drugs have been identified in drinking water around the United States. Now, these are all in the parts per billion, so these are extremely low levels. I don't like to fearmonger. But nonetheless, there's the concept of cumulative injury. We have no idea how all of these different exposures are interacting in our systems, particularly in the context of a diet that is bereft of antioxidants and compounds that help our bodies detoxify. So drinking clean water as often as we can, very, very helpful. We're now seeing microplastics in essentially every human. Every organism on Earth now has been contaminated with microplastics. And drinking water in plastic, for example, is a significant route of exposure. And also, the solution, or one of the solutions to pollution, is dilution. So we want to make sure that we're hydrating regularly. We just want to make sure, especially considering the fact that the body is 70+% water, we're drinking clean water on as consistent a basis as possible. So those are my high-level guidelines, I suppose you could say. But I'd love to, with the 20 minutes that I have remaining, open up the floor to questions. Thank you for listening. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. It's impossible to share everything in a 40-minute session, but I hope that was a good sort of lay of the land in terms of my overarching philosophy. And I don't know everything, but I love taking questions, and we've got about 20 minutes, so yes, bring me your best.
Thank you, Max. What are your thoughts about fasting as a way to help our body to regenerate white cells and also to control our calorie intake?
That's a great question. So I think fasting is a wonderful tool to control calorie intake. There's nothing magical about it. It's not required, but it is a tool that helps many people, and so I'm a fan, with the caveat that we do want to spend more time in a state of muscle protein synthesis as compared to muscle protein breakdown. So the total muscle that we carry on our bodies is the net result of a simple equation. How much time are we spending in a state of muscle protein synthesis versus muscle protein breakdown? And promoting muscle protein synthesis is done with resistance training, but it's also achieved when we ingest protein. So I'm not a fan of extended fasts because I think that can come at a cost to maintaining skeletal muscle. But in general, time-restricted eating as a means of controlling calorie intake, I think that's great. And then with immune function, was that the other part of your question?
It actually helps out also to regenerate the white cells on our body to do fasting.
So Walter Longo has done a lot of this research on the fasting mimicking diet as a way to press the reset button on your immune system. I think that that's really compelling research. For anybody with an autoimmune condition, fasting might be a worthwhile intervention to consider. But yeah, I personally don't do a whole lot of intermittent fasting myself. These days, I try to eat protein soon after I wake up, which we know actually protein soon after you wake up as your first meal to break the fast is a really great way to regulate your hunger throughout the day. So I don't intermittent fast very often myself, but a lot of people love it, and I think it's great if it works for you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Max. I love all your advices. I will follow them. And I like a lot Harvard study of adult development.
Yeah.
And it shows that there are lots of factors that help for longevity and to have a good life. And I would like to know from your studies, what are the influence of external other factors to health, like relationship, happiness, thoughts, faith, I don't know.
Yeah. That's a great question. So the Harvard study on adult flourishing or adult development. Yeah. I've had one of the lead researchers on my podcast, Robert Waldinger. Yeah. So essentially, what that study has found that the variable that seems to be most closely linked with successful aging is staying socially connected, and I think that's incredibly valuable. Yeah. So loneliness is a toxin. Essentially, we're starting to see, which is distinct from being alone. So being alone doesn't necessarily mean that you're lonely. We have introverts, we have extroverts. It's how you feel about your perception of being alone, I think, is most important there. But yeah, I mean, I buy into that research. I think social connection is crucially important, and staying connected to your, whether it's your spiritual community, having hobbies, family, I think really, really important. I don't think it's the only variable that matters. I think it's a stretch to say that it's the most important variable, but I definitely think it's important. Yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, so I would be interested in your point of view on how we can improve the food quality that is available in the United States. So I'm from Germany, and we have a lot stricter regulation about food availability, and the food that you can buy in a store has a lot stricter rules that they have to follow. And I would also argue that the food in Germany available is significantly healthier, generally, than in the United States. Do you think that is one way to improve food quality in the United States that is available to us, or do you see any other ways on how we can improve that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I'm pro-capitalism. I don't believe that, we should ban. Yeah. I don't think that banning, ultra-processed foods is the answer. But we do see that one of the reasons why our FDA seems to be so lax is due to corporate, collusion. And I think that's problematic. I think a stricter separation between church and state, with regard to these corporations' ability to influence. For example, I mean, our dietary guidelines, 95% of the board members on the committee who determine the dietary guidelines for Americans have financial ties with big pharma and big food. I think that's problematic, and I think that we have a responsibility to prevent harm, and I think that's a harmful relationship. I think front of package warnings could potentially make a lot of sense, but ultimately I think education. I think you can't put the genie back in the bottle once it's out, and the more we can kind of spread awareness around this stuff, I think the better, I think we'll be able to make an impact that way, because it's education that now has brought, for example, organic produce to Walmart. You can now go to any Costco and find, wild salmon in the freezer section, what you wouldn't have seen 10 years ago. And I think it's increased awareness that has, influenced these changes. So, yeah, less stricter rules around, industry influencing these guidelines and the like, and I think, yeah, that's a great starting place at the very least.
Thank you. Great talk.
Thank you.
Hello, Max. Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting for me. But I have one question. It's particular about the limit of protein that we can eat in one meal. I don't know. My question is, can I eat my 140 grams of proteins in 2 meals? Because I don't know, usually do 2 or 3 meals per day, and I don't know if that's proper or not. So that's my question.
Yes, you can. There's really no upper limit when it comes to whole food, because you will digest that food over time. So presumably, if you're eating 70 grams of protein in a meal, and that protein is not from a protein shake, which is very rapidly absorbed, that's fine. You'll have an infusion of those amino acids for hours after your first meal. So there is no, as long as you're hitting your target over a 24-hour period, timing is less relevant.
That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Hi, thank you for your talk.
Of course.
Do you have any suggestions for how to evaluate nutrition experts? As someone who is very interested in health, especially brain health, it's difficult for me to judge who is right. You argue today that increasing protein is better, while I have heard other experts argue the opposite. Now, the specific example is not important, but as someone who is not an expert, how do I judge what expert is right? What things should I be on the lookout?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, it's not, in my view, about credentials as much as it is about authenticity and integrity. And, a lot of people today on social media will make very strong claims. They will misinterpret research. They will be reluctant to publicize when they've changed their minds. So I think some indicators that you're following somebody who has integrity in the space, they don't have to be right about everything. Nobody's right about everything all the time. But somebody who's willing to admit when they've changed their mind, where they've evolved their opinions, who uses scientific language. For example, so-and-so, instead of saying something like so-and-so causes X, so-and-so may cause X, has been suggested to cause X, has caused X in animal models, and more research is needed to show whether or not there's an effect in humans. So you want to make sure that somebody is generally speaking with nuance, and I think that's a fairly easy thing to observe, especially today when wild claims are made, 24 hours a day on social media. So yeah, but I have empathy for your average consumer because it is really difficult. I mean, I know a lot of people who are highly credentialed in nutrition. I don't know them personally, but I see their work on social media, and some of them have the worst advice to offer, So it is difficult. I think you just have to find people with integrity, and people who are, willing to state where they've changed their mind, where they've been wrong in the past. I try to do this regularly, with my audience. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What would you recommend in terms of supplements and especially for an older person to take?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's tricky because there's no one size fits all. Like I couldn't just say everybody should take a certain supplement because there are very few, if any, supplements that everybody should take. In general, generally I'm a fan of, and I personally am not a major big supplement guy, but I take protein powder regularly. I take creatine. Creatine is a supplement that now there's a lot of evidence coming out showing that it can support brain health. So I think creatine is worth looking into. You want to check, anybody with a medical condition, you want to check with your physician first, but creatine is very valuable. I think for certain populations, fish oil is good from a cardiovascular health standpoint. Magnesium, collagen. I actually think collagen is a great supplement to take. Great for joints, for hair, skin, nails, things like that. So yeah, there's no one supplement that I would say everybody needs to take, but those are generally supplements that I think are worth considering. Protein, creatine, magnesium, fish oil. Yeah, start there. Thank you.
Hi, Max. So in your book, Genius Foods, you mentioned that it's okay to have any fasting-based diets, right, including ketogenic or intermittent fasting and so on. What you've said is the real focus should be on maintaining the body's natural rhythms, right? So my question is, let's say I want to pick your brain regarding when people are actually switching back to normal diets, right? What are some of the things that they should keep in mind? Because the said person is literally ruining the entire body's rhythms when they're switching back from a fasting-based or a ketogenic-based diet to a normal diet, right? And we have seen a lot of people going back to the same shape within a couple of months, or maybe even worse, right?
Yeah.
When they switch back. So I want to pick your brain regarding that.
Yeah, well, I don't think that's a function of circadian dysregulation. So our circadian rhythms are our body's natural clock, and many, intermittent fasting, time-restricted eating, these are tools, very valuable tools, I think, for many people. The reason why people tend to ping pong and go back to old patterns is because my assumption is that they had tried to adopt a way of eating that was just too extreme, that they stumbled on social media, that led to this binge restrict cycle that so many people seem to experience today. So the key really is to find what's going to be most sustainable for you. Fasting is not sustainable for every person. Ketogenic diets are not only not essential, but they're not sustainable. They're difficult to sustain. Yeah. You really need to find the dietary pattern that's going to work best for you, given your preferences, your life circumstances, and that's going to make it easier to sustain. So, that's why I'm not some people like low carb diets. Some people do better seemingly on low fat diets. Some people don't like to eat meat for whatever reason. So I think you really do just have to find something that is super sustainable and realize that what all diets have in common is that they try to get people to reduce their consumption of ultra-processed foods. All right. That's the one kind of takeaway, And then beyond that, you can kind of feel out the margins and find, don't be afraid to experiment and find what works for you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for that.
Hi. I wonder your opinion on nootropics, especially those that we cannot find in any of these nutritious products that you mentioned. I mean, what do you think about, let's say, ashwagandha, alpha GPC, and that sort of nootropic products and their regular consumption as a supplement, let's say?
Yeah. Nootropics, so cognitive enhancing compounds. I don't really, there aren't many that I'm familiar with other than caffeine, which is a really powerful nootropic. But there's no such thing as a biological free lunch. So I'm very cautious whenever I try new compounds, especially those that are marketed as nootropics. There is some data on lion's mane. Lion's mane mushroom has been shown in 2 small studies, but might play a role in boosting cognitive function. I think cocoflavanols also might support cognitive function acutely, insofar as they boost blood flow and the like. But yeah, I would say lion's mane is probably would be my favorite. But even that is not something that I regularly take.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for, let's do 2 more.
All right. Hey, Max. My question is, if you're familiar, what are your thoughts on longevity drugs such as metformin and rapamycin and the people who promote such drugs such as David Sinclair?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of, I wouldn't take metformin. They've shown that it can blunt exercise adaptation. There is a supplement that I do take called astaxanthin, ASTAXANTHIN, that as part of the NIH's interventions testing program was shown to boost lifespan in mice by 12%, male mice specifically, bringing it on par with the lifespans of female mice, because female mice and females in general tend to live longer. But yeah, astaxanthin is a great supplement that I personally take.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you for your speech. Are you aware of the use of small amounts of detergent to wash over the skin of apples and pears and to take out the herbicides from the skin? And if so, what's your thoughts about it?
I mean, generally, I just use water. There is some research showing that baking soda, vinegar, and I believe salt can increase the reduction of herbicide residues on produce surfaces. But, that's not something that I regularly do, I think that the dose makes the poison with a lot of this stuff, and I think, I have rules in my house where if I'm going to bring berries into my house, generally they're going to be organic. If I bring red meat into my house, it's going to be grass-fed. But when I'm out, I don't stress about it, and I just rinse my stuff,
Okay, take care.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Well, thank you guys so much. And thank you to the Objective Standard Institute for inviting me back. It means a lot. Thank you.